The Last Traveler by Jean Ray. In his checkered cap and his old overcoat, John was no longer the imposing waiter of the Ocean Queen Hotel. For the next 7 months, until the end of the off-season at the seaside, he was going to become once again an ironmonger on Humber Street in Hull. Mr. Buttercup, the owner of the hotel, gave him a friendly handshake. "I'll see you next year, John. I intend to open up on the 15th of May. "If it's God's will, yes," said John, solemnly drinking the farewell whiskey that his employer had poured for him. The dissatisfied rumble of a strong tide filled the mist-dulled air. "The season is really over," said John. "We're the last ones, the very last ones," added Mr. Buttercup. Distant figures, bent beneath shapeless burdens, were walking along the coast toward the little railroad station. "The stalkers are leaving," observed John. "The watchman on the pier told them there would be snow today." "Snow!" Mr. Buttercup said indignantly. "Why, we're scarcely into October." John looked up at the sky, rusted by sea mists. Cranes were passing in melancholy parades. "They're going past the marshes," he said. "It's a bad sign when they do that." A pure white bird flew by, crying, "Snow, snow, snow." "You hear," said John, trying to laugh. "Snow. That's outrageous," said Mr. Buttercup. Then he added philosophically, "Anyway, what difference does it make to me? Tomorrow the men will come to get the furniture that isn't going to hibernate here, and day after tomorrow I'll be in London." "Yes, what difference does it make?" John said approvingly. In the distance a hammer was tapping feverishly on wood. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mr. Buttercup. "Windry is going too. Listen, he's nailing the shutters of his house." "But then you'll be alone, completely alone," remarked John. "When the last train is gone, the station master goes to the village." Mr. Buttercup started. "Alone? Ugh. That's what I get for buying a hotel in this god-forsaken hole," he grumbled, "instead of in Margate or Folkestone." "But business wasn't too bad," John protested gently, patting the pocket in which his wallet was sleeping. "No, I suppose not," conceded Mr. Buttercup. A locomotive whistle from behind the horizon in a long, thread-like wail sounded. "Here comes the train," said John. "Well, goodbye, Mr. Buttercup." "Oh, you still have a little time. Have another drink." "Just one more, Mr. Buttercup. At my age, I can't run after trains any more." Mr. Buttercup remained alone in the dark, empty lobby. The hammer was no longer pounding beyond the road. "Finished, finished," creaked a snipe flying up from a nearby pond. "The season's finished, but I'm not," said Mr. Buttercup, trying to show the 12 rattan chairs in the lobby that he was still light-hearted. But neither the snipe nor the chairs cared about his undaunted spirit. Then he saw a man running desperately beside the railroad track. A whistle from the locomotive goaded the latecomer. He ran still faster, gesticulating like an unhappy puppet. Mr. Buttercup grunted with pleasure. "Mr. Windry has missed the train," he said to himself. "Ah, that's amusing." The ringing of the telephone interrupted his joy. It was the electricity works calling to tell him that the current was going to be cut off since the season was over. "But I'm still here," protested Mr. Buttercup. "We can't keep a dynamo going just for you." Mr. Buttercup lit one of the 2 green candles that adorned the piano, used a bottle as a candlestick, and gloomily poured himself another drink. Twilight was dying in the west. The flame of the candle flickered, pointing its tip at the formidable shadows that had stealthily crept into the lobby. Someone opened the door and sank into one of the rattan armchairs with a sigh. Mr. Buttercup looked at him incredulously. At first he had taken him for one of the shadows that were now moving boldly in the lobby, but another sigh, more painful this time, convinced him that it was a man who had sat down in the chair. The candle did not enable him to recognize him until he was only a few feet away. "Mr. Windry!" he exclaimed, relieved. "Well, this is a surprise. I saw you going to the station." "Missed the train," panted Mr. Windry. "You ran as fast as you could, though. I saw that. Good heavens! But you're out of breath." "Lungs very bad. Wanted to leave. Snow." "Again. But it's not going to snow." Mr. Windry's only answer was to extend a translucent hand toward the darkened windows, and the hotel keeper saw delicate white flakes fluttering through the evening shadows. "Well, well," he murmured, "after all, what of it?" "Not good for me," complained Mr. Windry. "I'll accompany you to your house." Mr. Windry shook his head. "Never mind. Everything in my house is either empty or locked up. I'll stay here if you have a room and a little hot tea." "Why, of course," Mr. Buttercup said eagerly, quickly assuming his role as a paid host. "Would you like some supper? I can give you cold beef, pâté, tinned fish, and cheese." "No, thank you. I only want some hot tea and a little rum, if you don't mind." "Of course not. You'll keep me company," Mr. Buttercup said good-humoredly. "I was all alone here. Everyone else has left. You were the last to go. I can't think of a worse punishment for a decent man than not having anyone to talk to on an October night, 100 yards from the bellowing sea, with no living voice around him except those of wild geese." But his companion was as gloomy as the night itself. Mr. Buttercup was alarmed to see him redden his handkerchief with large globs of sputum. They looked black in the dim light of the candle, and that made them all the uglier. After a plaintive good night, Mr. Windry went up to his room, taking the last green candle. Sitting before the pointed flame and drinking the bottle, Mr. Buttercup felt more alone than ever. He found the whiskey bitter and drank it in big swallows without savoring it. When he awoke, shivers of horror were running over his skin, but he did not know why, especially since the snow-padded night was perfectly quiet. As he was falling asleep, he had cursed Mr. Windry's rough cough. He no longer heard it now. "He's asleep," he thought, but he could not explain the instinct that urged him to huddle down into the warm cave of his covers. Although twilight, with its gliding shadows, should have seemed more hostile than this silent and splendidly clear night, he had not feared it. But he now said aloud in a quavering voice, "Come, come, what's going on here?" Nothing was going on. The moonlight was accentuating the silence. That was all. "What can it be?" he said in the same thin voice, and suddenly from the depths of the motionless night the answer came. It came in the form of dull, heavy footsteps. "Mr. Windry! Mr. Windry!" called Mr. Buttercup. Only the imperturbable footsteps answered his cry. They seemed to leave Mr. Windry's room and calmly go down the stairs. Mr. Buttercup threw on some unmatched clothes. He wanted to react against a nameless terror that was flowing toward him like shadowy water. He joked foolishly, "I can't complain of not having any company. First I was alone, then Windry came, and now here's another traveler." He leaned over the railing, but saw nothing, even though the staircase was reflecting a silvery light. The footsteps were at the bottom now. "Hello there," said Mr. Buttercup. "Mr. Traveler, Mr. Traveler, let's have a look at you." But his voice was more tenuous than a child's hair, and it scarcely reached his trembling lips. He fell silent without even thinking of calling Mr. Windry again, but he started down the stairs. The footsteps were coming from the lobby. A short time later, without any sound of locks or doors, they faded away in the basement. It later seemed strange to Mr. Buttercup that he did not think of getting a gun. When the footsteps had ceased, the silence gave him the courage to go prudently down the stairs. He took such minute precautions that he seemed to have become a burglar in his own hotel. Despite the triply posted notice, "Bolt your door at night," the door of Mr. Windry's room was not locked, and the hotel keeper was able to open it noiselessly. The moonlight showed him instantly that there was something tragic and baleful in that room. Mr. Windry was lying on the bed with his head sunken deeply into the pillow and his mouth black, open for a cry that seemed to be still audible. His open eyes reflected the blue light from the window. "Dead!" gasped Mr. Buttercup. "Good Lord, what a predicament!" 2 seconds later he was fleeing wildly toward the upper stories. The footsteps had just abruptly crossed the lobby and begun going up the stairs. If a man of science had later told Mr. Buttercup that at that moment a sixth sense related to the animal instinct of self-preservation had taken possession of his whole being, he would no doubt have been answered by a skeptical shrug. One thing is certain, however, Mr. Buttercup was in the grip of absolute terror. The shrill little voice of human reason had almost immediately stopped advising him to prepare an armed ambush in some dark corner. An imperious instinct resounded in his soul. I must get away. Against that, I'm powerless. He had just reached the top floor reserved for the hotel staff and the guests' servants. He tumbled against an artful disorder left by his dissatisfied employees. The footsteps were now going from room to room as though making a methodical inspection. It's in number 12, murmured the hotel keeper. Now it's in number 18, 22, 29. Dear God, it's in my room. It chilled his heart to know that the unknown that walked in the night was moving among the familiar and personal objects he had just left, as though a little of his being still clung to the things in that room. In the last of the servants' rooms he saw a holy water basin. He had a strange idea. Without making any noise, he blocked the hall with furniture and placed the holy water basin on top of this frail barricade. It has to come this way, he thought, and then he would have been at a loss if he had been asked to explain what he meant by it, but he had no time to reflect or reason. The footsteps were falling heavily on the bare steps that led to his refuge. They sounded more ominous and ferocious than ever. They seemed to make the whole building cry out in terror. I must go higher, he groaned. He reached the empty, dusty attic with its creaking floor. He looked around wild-eyed. Was this going to be the wretched setting of his death? Suddenly his hand touched a thin metal ladder, the observation platform. He ran up the ladder. The trapdoor in the ceiling, welded shut by rust and dirt, would not open. The footsteps reached the floor below, then passed the childish barricade. Even that doesn't stop it, thought Mr. Buttercup, weeping. He desperately thrust his head and shoulders against the trapdoor. It opened onto the vast blue night, blurred by snow but still sparkling with bright stars. The observation platform overlooked the whole surrounding countryside. He had never ventured onto it before. He felt waves of dizziness rising inside him. I'd rather jump off than have that get me, he cried. Walking on a thick mattress of snow, he went to the edge of the platform. A feeling of immense desolation seized his heart. Far away on the black surface of the sea, one light was following another. The yellow eye of the pier was insolently staring up at him from the depths of the darkness. Yes, I'd rather jump, he sobbed. A grating sound made him start. It came from the rusty rungs of the metal ladder. It came closer and closer until it reached the trap door. Then Mr. Buttercup saw the long stem of the lightning rod gleaming softly in the moonlight. He took hold of it with a gasp of horror, stepped over the railing of the platform, and with the wail of a soul in hell, let himself slide down into emptiness. Something jumped onto the platform. A pale tongue of light licked the horizon. At the bottom of the ashy trench of the railroad, a green lamp went on. The window panes of the little station were whitened by the icy glow of a gas light, and the first train whistled lazily into the invisible distance. Mr. Buttercup left the pile of creosoted cross-ties that had served as his shelter all night, and with stiff bones, bleeding hands, and a crazed brain, he ran to the lighted and inhabited little station, which seemed to him the most desirable oasis in the world. It was not until 11 o'clock, when he had heard the opinion of the doctor who had come from a nearby village on his bicycle and declared that Mr. Windrey had died a natural death from consumption, that Mr. Buttercup resolved to look over the hotel. He had found nothing suspicious in it, and was already accusing solitude, fear, and whiskey, when he reached the observation platform. There, beside his own footsteps, faithfully retained by the snow, he saw other footprints, hideous, terrifying, and incredibly large. They too went to the edge of the platform, but they did not return. It was as though the thing that walked in the night had made a monstrous leap. When he went back down to the lobby, he uttered an exclamation of joy on seeing the black vehicle that had come for the remains of poor Mr. Windry. He held its driver with whiskey and amusing stories until the arrival of the moving van, and he promised such a large tip to the moving men if everything was gone an hour before the departure of the last train that they hurried so much that they nearly broke everything, including their own limbs. An hour before the last train whistled its farewell, Mr. Buttercup was on the station platform. He had brought 2 bottles of whiskey for the station master, who helped him up the steps with brotherly affection and waved to him until the train was a tiny black lizard on the horizon. At a long table of the Silver Dragon, a friendly tavern on Richmond Road where Mr. Buttercup went to tell his story, his companions asked for cards, dice, and a checkerboard. "It's what's known as suggestion, auto-suggestion," said Mr. Chickenbread, who sold musical instruments in the spacious shop next door. "A hallucination," said Mr. Bitterstone, who was in the oil business. Mr. Buttercup scratched his cheek. "No one in the Buttercup family has hallucinations," he retorted, somewhat offended. Dice rattled, decreeing wins and losses. The white discs melted before the dark advance of the blacks on the neutral checkerboard. Only old Dr. Hellerman remained thoughtful. "I know," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to the placid Mr. Buttercup. "I know those steps. When I was an intern, I often heard them during quiet nights in the hospital, when nothing was awake except formaldehyde fumes and tearful grief. They moved without echoes down the long halls, studded with dim night lights. They preceded nocturnal stretchers being carried to the cold mortuary by silent-footed attendants. All of us, doctors, nurses, and attendants, used to hear them, but we had a tacit agreement never to mention them. Sometimes, though, a novice would pray aloud. Each time we heard them, we knew that a void had just been made in the painful life of the white-walled wards. When the somber sergeants of Newgate Prison prepare the black flag bearing a capital N for the approaching of dawn, they hear those footsteps moving along a stone corridor toward a cell more sinister than all the others. Dr. Hellerman fell silent and began watching a game of checkers with interest. And this is the end of The Traveler by Jean Ray.